hard to port, now or we're all dead men. The command from Captain A.C. May was a scream of pure desperation, nearly swallowed by the 90-mile-per-hour roar of the 1913 White Hurricane. On the bridge of the H.B. Hawgood, the world had dissolved into a chaotic nightmare of freezing spray and groaning steel. But his 18-year-old wheelsman Edward Kanabi felt a different pulse through the ship's wheel in a split second that would define the fate of every soul on board. The young man made a choice that challenged every law of the sea. What truly happened in the suffocating darkness of that pilot house? Was it a fatal mistake or a hidden truth that separated the Hawgood from the 12 ships that never returned? Stay with us until the very end to uncover a secret buried in the sand for over a century. Between a master's logic and a boy's intuition, who would you have trusted with your life? For generations, sailors whispered of the November gales, a seasonal rite of passage known as the 3-day blow. These storms were a predictable, if brutal, test of grit, 72 hours of turbulence, where the true killing window, the peak velocity of wind and wave, rarely lasted more than 4 or 5 hours. It was a grueling ordeal, yet it was a game whose rules were understood. But on November 9th, 1913, nature tore up the rulebook. What descended upon Lake Huron was a meteorological freak, a cyclonic engine of destruction later dubbed the White Hurricane. This was the lethal intersection of a massive low-pressure system surging from the south and a frigid Arctic front screaming from the west. While a standard gale eventually relents, this monster sustained winds of over 60 miles per hour for an agonizing, unprecedented 16 consecutive hours. The lake turned into a chaotic machine of death. Because the wind fetch was so long and the atmospheric pressure so low, it birthed the Three Sisters, monstrous steep waves exceeding 35 feet that traveled in rapid, rhythmic succession. When the first wave struck, it submerged the deck. Before the vessel could shed those thousands of tons of freezing water, the second wave hammered it deeper into the trough. By the third, the hull was often forced under completely or snapped like a dry twig. The sheer speed of this massacre remains unparalleled. In a span of just 4 hours on that Sunday evening, 8 massive steel freighters vessels believed to be the pinnacle of modern naval engineering simply vanished. The lake became a graveyard of giants, claiming 12 ships in total and 273 souls. Not a single person from those sunken vessels lived to tell what happened in those final moments. For those on shore, the lake was a black box. No survivors, no witnesses, only the grim arrival of frozen bodies washed up wearing life jackets from ships that were supposed to be miles apart. In 1913, the Great Lakes freighter had evolved into a unique breed of Titan, a design that began with the R.J. Hackett in 1869. These ships were built with a distinctive two-island silhouette, the bridge and pilot house perched at the very front of the bow, and the engine room at the far stern. In between lay a vast hollow steel cavern designed for one thing, only maximum cargo capacity for taconite, coal, and grain. It was the Queen of the Lakes era, characterized by a dangerous hubris. The industry's obsession with profit had created a fleet of underpowered giants. To save on fuel and construction costs, these 500-foot ships were often equipped with triple expansion steam engines, producing a meager 1,000 to 1,600 horsepower, less than half of what an ocean-going vessel of similar size would carry. Furthermore, the practice of untrimmed cargo meant that iron ore and grain were piled in steep pyramid-shaped mounds inside the holds rather than being leveled out. This left the ships catastrophically prone to rolling. When the Three Sisters began to batter Lake Huron, these design flaws became fatal. With no engine power to fight the wind and no stability to resist the roll, the steel hulls were at the mercy of a sky they couldn't predict. Weather forecasting was in its infancy. Captains relied on intuition and barometers that could barely keep up with the plummeting pressure. This was the Steel Age at its most arrogant, where the drive for efficiency had outpaced the respect for the elements, setting the stage for a collision between man-made logic and a storm that defied all reason. By the early afternoon of Sunday, November 9th, 1913, Lake Huron had ceased to be a navigable body of water and had instead become a predatory trap set by nature's most deceptive instincts. For the captains of the upbound fleet, the morning hours had offered a psychological false front, a lethal sense of security. These were not men easily frightened. They were seasoned veterans who had survived countless November gales, the kind of sailors who measured their lives by the rising and falling of barometers. As they steered their massive steel freighters north, they observed the weather with a cautious but familiar eye. The wind was rough and the seas were heavy, but to the experienced mind it appeared to be the retreating tail end of a standard gale that had already spent its fury on Lake Superior. The prevailing wisdom on the bridges of a dozen ships was that the worst had passed. This was the fatal miscalculation of the century. They believed they were witnessing the death of a storm, when in reality, they were witnessing the birth of a monster. As the clocks ticked toward 2 p.m., the meteorological architecture of the Great Lakes shifted with terrifying speed. A second, far more violent weather front, a bomb of low pressure, surged up from the south, moving with a velocity that defied all telegraphic warnings. This created a lethal pincer effect, effectively sealing the exits of Lake Huron. Captains who had finally decided that the northern run was too treacherous and sought the safety of the St. Clair River at Port Huron unknowingly made the one turn that ensured their destruction. By reversing course to head south, they were no longer running away from the storm. They were sailing at full steam directly into the advancing high-velocity heart of the White Hurricane. Among those caught in this invisible vice was Captain A.C. May of the H.B. Hawgood. At 434 feet long, the Hawgood was a formidable engine of commerce, a steel titan of the new age. Yet as May stood on his bridge, the cold realization of his error began to settle in, as biting and inescapable as the freezing mist forming on the pilot house glass. He had seen the storm warnings posted at the Sioux locks days earlier, but like so many of his peers, he had bet on the resilience of his ship and the accuracy of his own intuition. Now past the relative shelter of Saginaw Bay, the environment had undergone a terrifying metamorphosis. The lake was no longer water. It was a chaotic suspension of ice spray and density. Numbing cold and total darkness had turned the world into a whiteout of blinding horizontal snow, where the very concept of a horizon had vanished. The bow of his own ship, over 400 feet away, was now a ghostly silhouette, lost in the churning drift. The physical reality of the Hawgood's struggle was localized in the hands of the youngest man on board, 18-year-old wheelsman Edward Kanabi. At an age when most young men were barely finding their footing on land, Kanabi was braced against the mahogany and brass steering wheel with every ounce of his physical and mental strength. The Hawgood was traveling light, meaning she lacked the stabilizing ballast of a full cargo. Without that weight to pin her down, the ship began to roll with a sickening, violent rhythm. The motion was so extreme that Captain May was forced to abandon his standing posture. He was literally reduced to crawling on all fours across the pilot house floor, sliding from one side to the other just to reach the iced-over windows. Every time, the Hawgood crested one of the three sisters. The floor beneath Kanabi's feet seemed to vanish, replaced by a gut-wrenching tilt that reached 30-40 degrees. The strain on the steering gear was immense, a groaning symphony of metal that threatened to snap the rudder chains at any second. If they snapped, the ship would fall into the trough and capsize in minutes. In the midst of this isolated hell, the Hawgood was not alone, at least not yet. Through brief, terrifying tears in the swirling white veil, Captain May caught desperate glimpses of his fellow Titans. To his side, the lights of the Charles S. Price and the Regina flickered two other massive freighters fighting the same uphill battle against the southern surge. For a few fleeting moments, these lights served as a silent communal acknowledgement of their shared peril, a brotherhood of steel against the void. While Captain May and young Kanabi focused on the agonizing blind task of searching for the mouth of the St. Clair River, the Hawgood had become a solitary island of steel, blinded, battered, and freezing. She was led by a captain who realized his decades of experience were now useless against a storm that didn't follow the rules, and a wheelsman whose raw, aching hands were the only thing keeping 5,000 tons of steel from rolling into the lightless deep. The stage was set for the ultimate test of human survival, the moment when the map fails, the lights go out, and the only thing left is a choice between a traditional death and a radical, defiant life. While the HB Hawgood was wrestling for its life in the blinding whiteout of Lake Huron, another steel titan was meeting its doom, just miles away, providing a dark structural contrast to the Hawgood's survival. The Howard M. Hanna Jr. was a 500-foot freighter built by the Cleveland Shipbuilding Company, a vessel designed to be a workhorse of the American industrial engine, capable of carrying 9,200 tons of bulk cargo, or over 300,000 bushels of grain. On November 8, 1913, she departed Lorain, Ohio, her holds heavy with coal destined for Fort William. As she entered Lake Huron in the pre-dawn hours of November 9th, her 25-man crew had no inkling that they were sailing into a meteorological anomaly that would dismantle their ship and rewrite maritime history. By 6 p.m., the environment inside the Hanna Jr.'s pilot house had devolved into a nightmare of disorientation. Captain William Hagen had lost the one fundamental tool a sailor needs to survive: a sense of place. In a world where the freezing sky and the churning lake had merged into a singular screaming wall of horizontal ice and snow, Hagen was navigating a ghost ship. He estimated they were 15 miles off Point Obark, but the lake was about to prove him wrong with a violent mechanical efficiency. The disaster was triggered by a technical phenomenon known as falling into the trough. In the science of naval architecture, a ship is at its most resilient when its bow is pointed directly into the teeth of the wind. However, for an underpowered vessel like the Hanna Jr., maintaining that orientation against 70-mile-per-hour sustained gusts was a losing battle. a gargantuan wave struck the hull with the force of a battering ram pivoting the 500-foot ship broadside to the sea. Suddenly, the Hannah Jr. was trapped in the trough, the deep, terrifying valley between two mountainous waves. This was the death sentence for the Great Lakes design of 1913. Lacking the necessary horsepower to thrust her way back into the wind, the Hannah Jr. began to roll catastrophically. As the ship tilted to near impossible degrees, her stern rose so high that the propeller lifted completely out of the water, spinning uselessly in the freezing air, a phenomenon known as propeller racing. With the engine screaming and the blades hitting nothing but wind, the ship lost all steering and all thrust. She was no longer a pride of the Cleveland shipyards. She was a 5,000-ton piece of unguided driftwood. Just as Hagen realized they were helpless, a flash of light cut through the iced-over windows of the pilot house, the Port Austin lighthouse. It was not a beacon of hope, but a herald of imminent destruction. They were not 15 miles out. They were only a few hundred yards from the jagged Port Austin reef. In a desperate final attempt to stop the drift, Hagen ordered both massive anchors dropped. The chains shrieked as they hit the water, but on the rocky, storm-lashed bottom, they found no purchase dragging like toys behind the doomed freighter. The impact was cataclysmic. The Hannah Jr. was shoved broadside onto the rocks by a massive surge. The steel hull, made brittle by the plummeting temperatures, groaned under the kinetic stress and finally buckled, cracking wide open at the 17th hatch. As the stern flooded, the carnage moved to the upper decks. The wind was so ferocious it ripped the ship's massive funnel clean off its base, sending the ton-heavy steel cylinder crashing into the aft deckhouse. Inside, the 25 crew members were plunged into a nightmare of isolation and literal division. The crack in the hull made it impossible to cross from the bow to the stern. Those huddled in the forward cabin were cut off from their shipmates in the engine room with no radio and no way to signal through the whiteout. They could only huddle in the darkness, listening to the lake tear their ship apart plate by plate. Miraculously, despite the broken windows and the shredded superstructure, all 25 men survived that hellish night, clinging to life until they were rescued the following day. The Hannah Jr. would remain a broken skeleton on the reef, a grim reminder that in the 1913 storm, even a 500-foot giant was nothing more than a plaything for the white hurricane. By the late-night hours of November 9, 1913, the atmosphere inside the H.B. Hawgood's pilot house had transcended a mere physical struggle against the elements. It had evolved into a profound psychological war, a collision between 2 centuries of rigid maritime tradition and the raw, unyielding survival instinct of an 18-year-old boy. The 434-foot freighter was no longer a vessel of commerce. It was a steel cage in a state of terminal paralysis. Captain A.C. May, a man whose life was defined by his ability to command the Great Lakes, now stood in a world where his commands meant nothing. Desperate to find the mouth of the St. Clair River, he realized the lake had stripped him of his authority. The white hurricane had rendered his charts useless and his vision obsolete. In an act of absolute last resort, the final play in a veteran captain's handbook, May ordered the anchors dropped. It was a plea for friction against a world of fluid chaos. But the storm mocked his efforts. Even with the massive steel chains played out to their full scope, the 5,000-ton Hawgood was dragged like a child's toy across the uneven floor of Lake Huron. For 8 agonizing miles, the ship was pulled backward and sideways, her hull groaning under the kinetic force of thousands of tons of moving water. They were blind adrift and losing ground with every passing second. The anchors designed to hold against the heaviest gales were merely scraping the lakebed as the ship careened toward an invisible shoreline. Then, through the deafening 90-mile-per-hour roar of the wind, a new sound emerged, a rhythmic, low-frequency boom that vibrated through the very soles of their boots. It was the sound of breakers. In the cold logic of maritime doctrine, the shore is the ultimate enemy. To a sailor, open water is life and land is death. Captain May, adhering to the rigid blue water philosophy that had governed naval training for a century, saw only one path to survival they had to turn. He believed that the only way to save the ship was to put the bow back into the wind and flee into the deep, dark heart of the lake. Hard to port, get us back to open water. May's scream was fueled by decades of experience. To him, running aground meant the violent splintering of the hull, the flooding of the holds, and the certain death of every man on board. He was following the book. He was being a good captain. But 18-year-old wheelsman Edward Kanabi, his hands white-knuckled and aching as he gripped the wheel, felt a reality that May's charts could not register. Kanabi was attuned to the terrifying geometry of the three sisters battering their side. He understood a mechanical truth that May's professional pride refused to acknowledge. The Hawgood was too light, her engines were too weak, and her roll was too deep. Kanabi knew that if they attempted a hard turn now, the Hawgood would inevitably be caught broadside in the trough, the deep valley between waves. In that vulnerable moment of rotation, the 35-foot mountains of water would do to them exactly what they had done to the Charles S. Price just hours before they would flip the massive ship like a coin. Kanabi didn't just see the storm. He felt the ship's impending death in the resistance of the rudder. In a split second that defied every law of the sea, Kanabi chose mutiny. He did not turn the wheel. He locked his arms, ignored the veteran captain's direct screaming order, and did the unthinkable. He kept the bow pointed straight at the shore. Instead of fighting the white hurricane, Kanabi decided to use it. He allowed the storm to become their engine, letting the massive rhythmic surges of the lake propel the Hawgood like a battering ram toward the dark, sandy silhouette of Weiss Beach. He was betting 20 lives on a sandbar against the certainty of a capsize. The impact was a bone-jarring symphony of shrieking steel and shifting iron ore. The force was so cataclysmic that everyone on the bridge was thrown to the floor. Captain May later recounted that the momentum nearly launched him through the glass of the pilot house windows. The hull ground into the earth with a sound that felt like the end of the world. But as the grinding stopped and the ship settled, a miraculous, heavy silence followed. The Hawgood hadn't splintered into 1,000 pieces. Because Kanabi had kept her straight, she had carved a deep protective furrow into the soft sand, coming to rest perfectly upright and stable. When the gray, exhausted morning light finally broke through the whiteout, the crew looked out of their windows in utter disbelief. They were not at the bottom of Lake Huron. Their bow sat just 100 feet from the Lake Huron Hotel. In the blindness of the night, they hadn't just survived. They had parked a steel giant in what looked like a farmer's backyard. This moment forces us to confront a profound ethical question: the ethics of defiance. In any other circumstance, Kanabi's refusal to obey a direct order during a maritime crisis would have resulted in a swift court-martial, a ruined reputation, and a prison sentence. He was a novice, a boy of 18, challenging a master with 40 years of service. However, Kanabi didn't choose rebellion for the sake of ego or cowardice. He chose the preservation of human life over the sanctity of a failing doctrine. He recognized a rare, terrifying truth that when the rules of the world change so violently that they become a suicide pact, the only true virtue is the courage to break them. While 12 other ships and 273 sailors followed the established rules of the Steel Age, all the way to the lightless bottom of the lake, the H.B. Hawgood stood as a silent, upright monument to the boy who dared to say no to the sea and to his captain. It remains one of the few instances in naval history where a mutinous act was the only thing that prevented a massacre. It challenges every viewer to ask themselves, when the storm of the century arrives, will you have the wisdom to follow the master or the courage to trust your own hands on the wheel? While the H.B. Hawgood sat upright on a sandy beach, two other steel titans, the Charles S. Price and the Regina, became silent monuments to the terrifying power of a single decision. In the exact same window of time, under the same hurricane-force winds, three different philosophies of command led to three radically different fates. On the Charles S. Price, the decision was one of industrial indomitability. Built with 504 feet of reinforced steel, the Price was the pride of the Steel Age, a generation of shipbuilders and captains who believed that mass was an adequate substitute for caution. Her captain's strategy was rooted in the confidence of his era to press forward, trusting that his vessel's structural integrity could simply punch through the three sisters. It was a choice based on power. But on November 9th, Lake Huron proved that steel is only as strong as the laws of physics. As the ship rolled under the relentless pounding, the fatal flaw of the era untrimmed coal cargo shifted violently in her holds. That industrial confidence instantly became a dead weight that dragged her down. By choosing to fight the lake with brute force and muscle, the Price lost her stability and capsized so swiftly that not a single distress signal was sent and not a single man escaped. The storm didn't just sink her, it broke the back of the very philosophy she represented. In stark contrast, the Regina faced the chaos with a decision of calculated compromise. Captain Edward McConkie, younger and perhaps more keenly aware of the limitations of his smaller vessel, chose a middle path. He did not possess the hubris to punch through nor the recklessness to stand still. Instead, he sought a sanctuary. He made the perilous decision to turn toward the relative shelter of the Michigan shoreline near Port Sanilac. This was a choice governed by human judgment and a desperate desire to protect his crew. However, in a Great Lakes storm, a turn is the moment of ultimate vulnerability. By attempting to negotiate with the storm, McConkie exposed the Regina's beam to the breaking seas. In the blindness of the whiteout, his ship struck a submerged shoal and was dismantled by the waves. McConkie's decision was one of heroic effort and careful navigation, yet it ended in the same lightless deep as the Price. Then there was the H.B. Hawgood, where the decision was one of radical defiance. While the Price chose power and the Regina chose shelter, the Hawgood survived because 18-year-old Edward Kanabi chose to throw away the map entirely. He didn't fight the storm like the Price, nor did he try to hide from it like the Regina. It was a decision that violated every maritime law and invited a court-martial, yet it was the only one that worked. The contrast is chilling and profound. The ship that followed the rules of industrial strength turned upside down. The ship that followed the rules of careful traditional navigation broke apart on the rocks. But the ship that broke every rule in the book, the ship that committed a mutiny of instinct against tradition, was the only one whose crew walked away to tell the tale. When the bodies from the Price and the Regina washed up together on the Michigan shore, they left behind a final silent lesson for every captain who would ever sail the lakes. In the heart of a 100-year storm, the most dangerous thing you can bring with you is a decision you refuse to change. As the snow finally settled on the morning of November 11th, the Great Lakes revealed a landscape of surreal, silent devastation. For the crew of the H.B. Hawgood, the miracle of their survival was not met with cheers, but with a hollow, haunting silence. Looking out from their grounded bow at the Lake Huron Hotel, an image that remains one of the most jarring photographs in maritime history, they realized they were safe, yet they were not whole. This transition from the terror of the storm to the grim reality of its wake marks the beginning of a legacy that would reshape an entire industry. In a strange, almost ironic twist of fate, both the H.B. Hawgood and the Howard M. Hanna Jr. ships that had been battered, cracked, and nearly reclaimed by the elements were eventually salvaged. Through monumental engineering efforts the following year, these steel giants were pulled from the sands and reefs, repaired, and returned to the very waters that had tried to swallow them, to swallow. The Hawgood would continue to sail for 3 more decades under new names, like the Pentecost Mitchell, finally meeting the scrapyard in 1946. But while the steel could be mended and the rivets replaced, the men who manned them were permanently altered. Captain May and Edward Kanabi carried a weight that no repair crew could fix: survivor's guilt. They were among the very last souls on Earth to see the Charles S. Price, the Regina, and the Isaac M. Scott upright. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw those flickering lights vanishing into the whiteout. They were plagued by the agonizing question of why? Why were they allowed to park on a beach while 273 of their fellow sailors were being preserved in ice at the bottom of the lake? For Kanabi, the 18-year-old who broke every rule to save his world, the victory was bittersweet. He had saved 20 lives, but he had witnessed the annihilation of an entire era of maritime confidence. The aftermath also revealed a second storm, one of cold corporate ruthlessness. As bodies began to wash ashore along the Michigan and Ontario coastlines, some from the Price, others from the Regina, often frozen together in grim final embraces, a battle began in the courtrooms and insurance offices. The powerful shipping conglomerates, desperate to avoid the massive financial liability of 12 lost vessels, launched a campaign of systemic injustice. They sought to deflect blame away from the structural flaws of their underpowered, untrimmed ships and onto the men on the bridges. They attempted to paint deceased captains like McConkie as incompetent, suggesting the disasters were mere errors in judgment rather than failures in design. It was a brutal reminder that in the gilded age of steel, the bottom line often carried more weight than human life. Yet from this mountain of wreckage and corporate deflection, a vital legacy emerged. The disaster of 1913 served as a violent, undeniable wake-up call for the United States and Canada. It became the catalyst for the birth of the modern National Weather Service. The government finally realized that a primitive system of flags and lanterns was no defense against a white hurricane, a term that transitioned from a panicked headline into a formal meteorological classification. The tragedy forced the mandatory implementation of radiotelegraphy on all large vessels, mandated more powerful engine requirements for Great Lakes freighters, and led to the creation of the rapid response storm warning systems we rely on today. We no longer sail into the dark as Captain May did. We sail with the hindsight purchased by the 273 souls lost in Huron's depths. Ultimately, the story of the HB Hawgood is more than a maritime chronicle. It is a profound meditation on the human condition. It reminds us that the line between a survivor and a ghost is often drawn with the ink of sheer luck and the courage of decisive, albeit rebellious action. It stands as a timeless warning against the hubris of believing we have mastered the elements through steel alone. In the end, we are reminded that whether we follow the rules or have the audacity to break them, we are all just temporary guests on these inland seas. As the years turn into centuries, the white hurricane remains the ultimate benchmark of nature's power, a reminder to cherish every moment of calm, for the lake always keeps its secrets, and it never truly relents. Before concluding today's message, thank you for standing with us on this journey into the heart of the storm. We honor the 273 sailors lost on November 9th, 1913, fathers and sons who became ghosts within just 4 hours of chaos. 12 ships vanished, but their legacy remains a guiding light for our safety today. If you have a story, a family connection, or a mystery about the Great Lakes, please share it in the comments below. Your voice keeps this history alive. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to support our work. I look forward to seeing you in our next video. Fair winds and following seas.